E aí, galera, sejam bem-vindos à transmissão. Eu não sei qual é o professor que dá essa aula, mas eu vou pôr aqui o MP3 secreto supremo, que é de alguma faculdade, de algum professor explicando, quer dizer, contando esse período anterior ao começo das guerras médicas. Eu vou direto ao arquivo, mas ele é em inglês. Então é isso aí. E até breve. Ah, eu tô vendo vocês no chat, mas isso aqui tipo, vai ser o bagulho tocando. Eu não vou macular o arquivo. Então eu converso com vocês em texto aqui.
A History of Ancient Sparta, Lecture 7. The Early Days, Before the Persian Wars.
Well, over the next few years, the political situation in Greece and between Sparta and Athens and between both of them in Persia proceeds to get very complicated. Ruling in Athens for a while had been the family of the tyrant, a benign tyrant, as tyrants go, but the tyrant nonetheless, which is to say non-royal, one-man, strongman ruler, Pisistratus. He died. His son, Hippias, took over as tyrant in Athens. And historically, the Pisistratids, as they were called, and the Spartans had had pretty good relations. Despite Sparta's reputation for, where possible, working to oust tyrants, not only in the Peloponnese, but again, where possible, elsewhere, generally in favor of sympathetic oligarchs. Again, if possible. Well, the situation in Athens was relatively unstable, more so than it had been under Pisistratus, who had had his own problems. And in 514, there was an attempt, which was later much valorized by the Athenians as sort of the beginning moment of their liberty, when two conspirators, Aristogiton and Harmodius, later celebrated as the Tyrannicides, attempted to kill Hippias, but things didn't work out. They instead managed to kill his brother Hipparchus and were themselves executed. Meanwhile, relations with Sparta had soured to some degree. This is not entirely clear, but very likely because Hippias seemed to be in favor of relations with Persia, to have gone pro-Persian, to have Medized, as the saying went at the time. Actually, the dominant groups in Persia were the Medes, who had previously been dominant, and then the Persians, who were closely akin. Cyrus himself was a Persian. Greeks, however, customarily referred to Persians as Medes. The Medism, or pro-Persian policy of Hippias, and the tyrannical character of his government led, first of all, to a failed attempt to oust him in 512, and then in 510, Cleomenes succeeded in removing Hippias from control in Athens. The situation in Athens thereafter remained relatively unstable. One of the leading politicians of Athens was a man in the very prominent Alcmaeonid family by the name of Cleisthenes. As a strongman or leader, however, Cleomenes favored Isagoras, another Athenian politician, and by malicious report, and perhaps truthfully, favored also, and to no small degree, Isagoras' very attractive wife. Be that as it may, he succeeded about 508 in forcing Cleisthenes to leave town, Cleisthenes, meanwhile, in his political jockeying, in order to secure his return to power, decided to take an unprecedented step. And the unprecedented step which Cleisthenes took was to involve the Athenian demos, to promise them a share in power if they would support him against Isagoras and other rival candidates. This, in the winter of 508-07, the Greek calendar, remember, began for most cities, Athens and Sparta included, at midsummer, so they thought of years as we think of, in effect, academic years. In the year 508-507, then, the reforms of Cleisthenes in favor of the demos, in effect, founded democracy in Athens. And Athens was, so far as we know, the first democracy on record, and a vastly more responsive and inclusive, non-representative direct democracy than anything which remotely exists on a national level in the modern world. Well, meanwhile, Persia continued to be interested in expanding. Athens was negotiating with Persia, and in 507, though they got in some trouble for this, Athenian envoys offered earth and water to Persia. And to offer earth and water to Persia was, in effect, to accept Persian overlordship. The Athenians later repudiated the gesture of their envoys, but Cleomenes certainly was under the impression that the Alcmaeonids were pro-Persian, and indeed later Alcmaeonids, Pericles and Alcibiades among them, whom we will encounter later, certainly were more pro-Persian than they were pro-Spartan. In any case, in response to these difficulties, and perhaps to the perceived Medism now of Athens, or Medistic tendencies of Athens, Cleomenes in 506 decided once again to invade Attica and to depose Cleisthenes and the democracy if possible. At no point did Sparta approve of democracies. They preferred oligarchies. The Corinthians, as usual, were allied with the Spartans in this expedition in 506, but by this time, the rivalry between, on the one hand, Cleomenes, who was adamantly anti-Persian, and Demaratus, his brother king, the Eurypontid king, who was more or less pro-Persian, their rivalry had become really severe and troubling. As a result, as they were approaching Athens, with Cleomenes in the lead, Demaratus pulled out or failed to show up with his Spartan contingent, and beyond that, persuaded the Corinthians to pull out as well. So Cleisthenes remained in power, and Cleomenes, who was none too fond of Demaratus before, was vastly less fond now. At this point, about 499, by the way, though Sparta was at something close to the peak of her power, Athens was not yet what she later became, and the city most like what Athens would become in terms of wealth, prominence, and cultural vibrancy was the city of Miletus, just opposite the island of Samos on the actual Aegean coast of Turkey, just a little bit to the south of Samos. And the people in Miletus were a bit restive under Persian rule, under their tyrant Aristogorus. They were contemplating a revolt, not just of Miletus, but indeed of as many of the Ionian Greeks as possible who were at that point under Persian control. And in order to gather strength for his proposed rebellion, Aristogorus of Miletus came to Sparta and came to the house of Cleomenes, king of Sparta. During his negotiations with Cleomenes, Aristogorus noted to his annoyance the presence in the room, which would be a little bit surprising for a high-level diplomatic negotiation, which this assuredly was, of Cleomenes' only child, his 8 or 9-year-old daughter, Gorgo. And Aristogorus did his best to persuade Cleomenes that he should participate in the revolt against Persian rule. That end in view, he brought with him something which was absolutely technologically cutting edge at this point, a map, which purported to show all of Persia, and he pointed out the Lydians and the Cappadocians and the Syrians and the Cilicians and the Armenians and so on and so on and so on, right to the Persian capital area in central Persia itself. And he tried to engage Cleomenes' interest in the vast wealth to be gained by conquest. Well, Cleomenes asked for a day to think things over. And when Aristogorus returned the next day, he said, I have one question. How far is it from the coast to the Persian heartland? And here, according to Herodotus, was where Aristogorus made his fatal mistake. His answer was 3 months, at which point the horrified Cleomenes said, my guest friend of Miletus, you must depart from Sparta before sunset. Your request will never be accepted by the Lacedaemonians if you intend to leave them on a 3-month journey away from the sea. Threw him out of the house. Then, however, Aristogorus decided he would come as a suppliant, and he began to offer bribes. First, 10 talents, if Sparta would help. Well, a talent is, in contemporary purchasing power, not $1 million, but close. Something like $700,000, $800,000. So 10 talents is a substantial sum. Cleomenes still turned him down. He kept upping the ante until he finally got to 50 talents, at which point, famously, as we've mentioned before, Gorgo reportedly said, Father, your guest friend is going to corrupt you unless you leave and stay away. Cleomenes, according to Herodotus, was pleased with his child's advice, went to another room, and Aristogorus departed, and the Spartans did not take place in the Ionian revolt. Aristogorus, however, nothing deterred, or little deterred, went on to Athens, where he spoke to the Athenian assembly of about 30,000, and they went for it. Herodotus dryly observes it proved easier to corrupt 30,000 people than it did to corrupt one. Ordinarily, Herodotus is fairly pro-Athenian. In this case, perhaps, Sparta comes off best. In any case, Athens, which at this point was nothing like the naval power she would shortly become, detached 20 ships in 498, along with a few ships from Eritrea, a city on the island of Euboea, which extends along the eastern coast of Greece between Athens and Thermopylae. And when the time came, Athens and Eritrea both participated in the kind of bungled burning of the local Persian subcapital, regional capital of Sardis. This, as you might imagine, infuriated the Persians. This was presumption of, if not an unprecedented kind, a kind that had to be answered. When King Darius, who was now ruling Persia, first heard of what had happened, he asked, "Who are the Athenians?" as his father had asked, "Who are the Spartans?" A generation and a bit more before, and when he found out was so incensed that famously he is said to have instructed an attendant to say to him every day at dinner, repeatedly, "Remember the Athenians. Remember the Athenians, who have so insulted you." Well, the Athenians actually soon thought better of their participation, and the Eritreans too, but the Ionian revolt continued from 499 or thereabouts to 494, and concluded in a way which, rather to my surprise, historians have not made much of, though to me it is very illuminating with regard to what would happen later on in the central phase of the Persian Wars themselves. Over the course of the next several years, the Persians conducted operations gradually reconquering the cities which had revolted, till finally in 494, Miletus and the other cities and islands which were still resisting Persia decide to concentrate their forces and risk all in a naval battle off the tiny island of Lade or Lade. Actually, the battle is so seldom discussed, I've never heard anyone else say the word. I presume that the English pronunciation is Lade, but in all honesty, I'm not dead sure about that. In any event, the Samians, the other Ionians, people from the island of Samos and the other islands and cities which were still free along the coast, and the people of Miletus themselves assembled a major fleet at the island of Lade, just off the coast from Miletus, to take on the Persian fleet. The Persian fleet actually requires a little bit of discussion. Persia itself was a land power, and if by Persian fleet one means fleet indigenous to Persia or manned primarily by Persians, there was no such thing. But in the previous generation or so, under the leadership of Cyrus's son Cambyses, the Persians had conquered Egypt, and in the process had also conquered Phoenicia, what's now Lebanon, in effect. And the Phoenicians were, hands down, even the Greeks confessed, the most proficient sailors in the ancient world. Greeks themselves were probably second, and the Greeks never willingly conceded first place to anybody in anything in preference to themselves unless the evidence was absolutely incontrovertible. So the fact that the Greeks themselves thought of the Phoenicians as their maritime superiors suggests that they were. The Persian fleet, unsurprisingly, was largely Phoenician, with a substantial contingent from Egypt as well. And the Egyptians, while not Phoenicians, weren't bad. There were also a substantial number of Ionian Greeks in the Persian fleet. So it was a formidable and crack force. Nevertheless, the rebelling Ionians liked their chances better certainly than the prospect of simply surrendering or taking the Persians on in a land battle. And the Persians accordingly made an offer. And the offer was this, with regard to the Ionic coalition gathered at Lade against them. If you surrender or defect, there will be no penalties for your rebellion. You will go back to exactly the status quo ante, paying taxes and so forth, but there'll be no reparations or penalties. If you continue to fight against us, and as you will, you lose, then we will execute your adult males and enslave your women and children, and if you have any handsome boys, we'll castrate them and make eunuchs of them and send them on to Persia. Your call. This was a little dispiriting, and what happened at the Battle of Lade was, once the fleets prepared to engage, the sailors from the island of Samos, all but a few, and the ships from the island of Samos, all but a few, did in fact defect. A remainder fought heroically and fatally and lost, but most defected. And most of the other Ionians fled as well, leaving the Melitans to get their bacon out of the fire on their own, which they failed in doing, and the Persians kept their word with regard to Miletus and Miletus's days as a great cultural center and trading entrepot and leading light of the Hellenic world were over. This was so distressing to Athens, by the way, that the following year a rival of Aeschylus entered the annual tragedy contest, the festival of Dionysus, with a play entitled The Destruction of Miletus. The Athenians were so upset by that play, so appalled by what they were plenty aware enough to foresee as possibly their own fate depicted in the play, that they fined Phrynichus 1,000 drachmas for writing it and vow that it should never be produced again. That's a little peculiar since, at least at this point, plays were ordinarily produced only once, but nevertheless, Phrynichus had to pay the fine, and a fine of 1,000 drachmas is about $20,000, so it was a real fine. The key point to remember, though, with a view toward the future, is that the first time the Persians and the Greeks met in a sea battle, lots of Greeks defected, and the Greeks were utterly trounced. This, by the way, a mere 14 years before the Battle of Salamis, which would have made every sailor in the fleets at Salamis well aware of those previous results. Meanwhile, the Persian threat with regard not only to Ionia, but also to Athens certainly, and by extension to Sparta, was growing ever clearer. That was one factor contributing to the Spartan performance in the Battle of Sepia against Argos. Cleomenes was under the impression, probably rightly, that Argos was Medizing, though the motives of Argos in Medizing, my suspicion is this may have had more to do with the notion that the enemy of my enemy is my friend than any major affinity on the part of Argos for Persia. What the Argives seem to have liked about Persia was that the Spartans didn't like them. In any case, bad blood between Argos and Sparta being very long-standing, Cleomenes mounted an attack near Tiryns, quite close to Argos itself, against the Argives at Sepia. They won a victory, and about 6,000 Argive warriors reportedly took refuge in a sacred grove. The Greeks took very seriously the notion that suppliants in a sanctified place were inviolable, and the Spartans, again, took such things more seriously than most, and everybody took them seriously. What Cleomenes accordingly did is manage to lure out of the grove about 50 of the Argives, whom he then immediately killed. But the Argives figured out what was going on and thereafter refused to leave. At which point, and this is pretty unedifying stuff, but here it is, Cleomenes had the Helot retainers of his army set fire to the grove and burn alive the Argives who had taken refuge there. The reason for having the Helots actually set the fire was the Spartans did not themselves want the ritual pollution. Well, this assured that when the time came, Argos would be, if not pro-Persian, neutral in any fight in which Sparta participated, and it also essentially knocked out Argos as a military power for the next generation. Meanwhile, in 492, Persian efforts were intensifying. Mardonius, closely connected to, indeed, in a sense, a member of the Persian royal family, mounted a fleet attack designed to take care of Athens, moving around the northern shore of the Aegean. But off Mount Athos, the fleet ran into a storm which, ancient warships being notoriously unseaworthy, so severely damaged them that the attempt to punish Athens had to be called off. Meanwhile, Athens' great local enemy and trading rival at this early point, and naval rival, indeed at this point, naval superior, the island of Aegina, Medized. Persia was asking for earth and water from polis all over Greece, and Aegina went along with it, perhaps under the encouragement of Cleomenes' rival king, Demaratus. The Athenians were worried by this. They, of course, were likewise anti-Persian. Aegina was their rival to begin with. They asked for Spartan assistance in deposing the people in Aegina who had Medized, and Cleomenes went over to Aegina and attempted to do just that, dealing with a recalcitrant gentleman in Aegina by the name of Creos, or Ram. Creos evidently had received from Demaratus a letter claiming that Cleomenes had no full Spartan authority for his efforts to change the policy of Aegina. This greatly irritated Cleomenes, who supposedly said to him after asking his name, Creos Ram, "Cover your horns in bronze then, Ram, because you are about to encounter great trouble," as indeed a later intervention brought about when Krios was sent to Athens as a hostage, and the decision of Aegina to Medize was reversed. The Athenians and Spartans themselves had meanwhile received envoys from Persia, asking once again for earth and water, and they put themselves well beyond the possibility of compromise with their response at this time, around 492. The Athenians, through the Persian envoys, heralds who had sacrosanct status, in the pit where they put executed criminals, presumably having executed them beforehand. The Spartans, through the envoys, down into a well to let them die, telling them in the process that once in the well, they could find all the earth and water they would have any use for. That was, for sure, little short of a declaration of war, and, as we will see, the war was not long in coming.
This ends Lecture 7. A History of Ancient Sparta, Lecture 8. The Ionian Revolt to Marathon.
By 491, Cleomenes had had more than enough of the machinations of his Eurypontid co-king Demaratus, who had thwarted him at every turn for 15 years and whom he suspected of pro-Persian sympathies, as well as holding against him, no doubt, their long-standing personal rivalry. And what Cleomenes finally did was went to Delphi and bribed the Delphic oracle so that the oracle would claim that, as Demaratus' father had believed long before, Demaratus was in fact illegitimate and a bastard. This succeeded in persuading the folks at Sparta. Demaratus was in fact deposed, and according to Herodotus, went finally to his mother, who was still alive, and said, "Who really is my father?" His mother told him that it was either Ariston, the Spartan king, or a god who had come to her during that period at night. But for all practical purposes, so far as she could tell, he was either legitimate or semi-divine. Nevertheless, he was deposed, and Cleomenes engineered that one of his cousins, Leotychidus, would take the kingship in his place. Leotychidus had special reason for hating his cousin Demaratus. Demaratus had earlier on, just when Leotychidus was about to get married, stolen his fiancée and married her himself. He was grateful to Cleomenes, some say a tool of Cleomenes, certainly glad to be king in Demaratus' place, and he taunted Demaratus publicly, asking him how he liked things now that he was no longer a king, in such a way that in powerfully shame-based Sparta, Demaratus just left, and ultimately, this I am sure, proved absolutely no surprise to Cleomenes, finally went to Persia, where he became part of Xerxes' entourage, and indeed, in later years, was an advisor, according to Herodotus, of Xerxes when Xerxes himself finally invaded Greece. Cleomenes, however, had himself finally gotten into trouble with the Spartans on two counts. the episode of burning the Argives in the sacred grove, whether or not it was Helots who had done the actual burning, did not go down well in pious Sparta, militarily decisive though it was. And when word came out that he'd bribed the Delphic oracle, that struck the Spartans as positively sacrilegious, and Cleomenes himself took off for the hinterlands for a while. Some folks think that he may have been contemplating fomenting a revolt against Sparta to get his power back. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm kind of inclined to doubt it. At any rate, he was recalled finally to Sparta and did come back, which suggests that if he had been plotting, he certainly didn't think the Spartans knew about it. But he had always been, so we are told, a bit of an odd lad. Many contemporary historical authorities think that Herodotus is a bit biased against him, and when Herodotus says that he'd been a little crazy his whole life, and toward the end of his reign got flat out super crazy, some folks are inclined to doubt that. In any case, what Herodotus says is that after he came back to Sparta, he took to menacing people with his staff on street corners, just walking up to people and waving this stick in their face and generally making a nuisance of himself, to the point that the Spartans decided what they needed to do was restrain him. So they put him in the stocks. And so the story goes, while he was in the stocks, really crazy now, he persuaded the Helot who was guarding him to give him a knife, which, as a former king of Sparta, talking to a Helot, the power differential, even if you were crazy and in the stocks, I think probably would have been plenty enough to persuade a Helot to give him the knife. And what Cleomenes thereupon did was began slicing pieces of flesh off his legs, moving up his legs to his thighs, moving up his thighs to his midriff, and in effect slowly committing suicide. What the Spartans themselves said was not so much that he was crazy in a neurological sense by birth or as a result of stress or whatever, but rather that he had at some point picked up the very un-Greek habit of drinking unmixed wine and lots of it, and he finally collapsed through what we would term terminal alcoholism. Whatever the story finally is, he was gone, and in no very pleasing way. Others have thought, and this I have no strong opinion on myself one way or the other. I find myself actually, I suppose, inclined to believe the traditional account that he really did kill himself. But some have thought, Sparta being the secretive place that it was, that they just decided, the Spartan leadership group, that he was getting to be more trouble than he was worth and just had him killed. Whatever happened, by 490 he was dead, 490 or 491, and in his place, his half-brother Leonidas ascended the throne, having married Cleomenes, or ultimately marrying, in any case, Cleomenes' daughter, Gorgo. Leonidas, we will hear a great deal of shortly. One thing that sets Leonidas apart, and there are many, but one thing that sets him apart in any case from most Spartan kings, is that the heir apparent to either royal house in Sparta did not have to go through the agoge and did not go through the agoge, the traditional upbringing that all other Spartan citizens were subjected to, or enjoyed, or were shaped by, or all of the above. Leonidas did. And it's interesting and perhaps not surprising that among the most effective Spartan kings were those who were not exempted from the traditional upbringing, but participated in it as indeed members of the royal family, but not heirs apparent. Leonidas had gone through the 100% full treatment. Well, in 492, remember, Mardonius, whose ambition was, if the Persians ever succeeded in conquering Greece, to become satrap or local ruler, in effect governor, viceroy of the new province or satrapy of Greece, should there come to be one. He had led a punitive expedition toward Athens around the Aegean to the north, which had come to grief in storms off Mount Athos in the far northern Aegean. This time, Dares mounted a punitive addition more or less right across the Aegean, which was explicitly designed, perhaps, I suspect, as a first step toward more wide-ranging conquests in the area, but certainly to punish Eretria on the island of Euboea and Athens for their presumptions. The leaders were Artaphernes and Datis, not Mardonius this time, whose bad success last time perhaps had led to his being put on the shelf for at least a while. And this led ultimately, of course, to the very famous Battle of Marathon, which was perhaps Athens' finest hour, so they thought. Many people would argue Salamis, about which more a bit later. But for the Athenians themselves, Marathon reigned in subsequent eras crystal clear as their moment of self-definition. The Persian fleet got across this time without any problems from storms to speak of, landed at Eretria and took care of Eretria and subjected it without any inordinate trouble, and thereafter, at the suggestion of the long-deposed former tyrant of Athens, Hippias, who had always been, at least to some degree, pro-Persian, or so his enemies thought, and after he had been deposed, had gone to Persia. He, now an old man, was in hopes that Persia would reinstall him as ruler of Athens, now under Persian hegemony. He was the one who picked Marathon as an appropriate landing place for the Persian expeditionary force. Well, by now, the Spartans and the Athenians were clearly in it more or less together, and they were both expecting a Persian response. So when the Athenians got firm news that the Persians were not just planning mischief, but doing everything in their power to bring it about, they dispatched a man by the name of Philippides, or Phidippides, accounts vary, to let the Spartans know that the Persians were a clear and present danger, and that Athens was going to need Spartan help as soon as possible. The story has often been told, but it's a splendid story. Phidippides, or Philippides, was what the Greeks called a hemerodromos, a wonderful word which means all-day runner, a professional courier who presumably had trained for life to be enabled to run very long distances at the fastest possible speed. I presume just the ruggedness of the Greek countryside being such and the rareness of horses being such that the fastest way to communicate emergency information was with a long-distance runner. And it was a long-distance run. The distance between Athens and Sparta is about 150 miles, which is a sextuple marathon or quintuple marathon, more or less. Not only that, in the Greek summer, temperatures, as we've mentioned before, in southern Greece, range certainly in the 30s Celsius, in the 80s or 90s Fahrenheit, and Greece is a very mountainous country. So this is a pretty formidable run, beyond a super marathon. Philippides made it to Sparta, though, in about 36 hours, which is not bad, where he told the Spartans that the Athenians needed their help and needed their help pretty much now. Meanwhile, something very interesting happened to him, and this is, to me, one of the oddest things in Herodotus. I hardly know how to take this, presented deadpan as it is. Herodotus writes, "Now, Philippides himself reported to the Athenians afterward that when he was running in the vicinity of Mount Parthenion overlooking Tegea, getting towards Sparta, about 80, 90 miles into the run, the god Pan fell in with him." What? Here is this guy running along, and suddenly the god Pan appears and shouted out his name, Philippides. And he ordered him to ask why the Athenians were paying no attention to him, the god Pan, though he was well disposed toward them, had already and often been of service to them, and would serve them further in the future, not least at the upcoming Battle of Marathon. We're told that the Athenians believed this report was true, and once their affairs were settled and stable again, set up a shrine to Pan below the Acropolis in response to his message, and indeed they propitiate Pan with sacrifices and a torch race every year. Just so you know, sometimes there are unexpected benefits, I suppose, to extremely long-distance running under duress. Well, the Spartans were more than willing to help the Athenians, and when the time came, dispatched 2,000 of their elite crack citizen hoplites at a very fast march. They did not make it in 36 hours to Marathon, but they made it in not too much more than that, and in armor, but in the event didn't get there in time. Rather like their efforts perhaps to aid Croesus several generations before. And the reason they couldn't get there on time was because of their piety. Some have argued that, in fact, there was helot unrest at the time, this being shortly after the death of Cleomenes. That may or may not be true. I'm more inclined to take it at face value. When the Carnea was going on, major festival that it was to the Spartans, they were most reluctant to leave. They didn't want to be impious. They didn't want to offend the gods. The Spartan idea was, how could you expect to win a battle if the gods were fighting against you? And certainly, once the requisite time period had passed and the moon was in its correct phase, as far as the Spartans were concerned, they came with better than all deliberate speed and were duly impressed at the battlefield. They marched on past Athens to the battlefield itself and congratulated the Athenians heartily on what, from a Spartan perspective, I would imagine was unexpectedly good work. Well, the Persians landed at Marathon, called the plain of Marathon, traditionally, and it is a plain of sorts, though Greece being the mountainous region that it is, a plain in Greece does not look a great deal like the Dakotas or Kansas. It's a small, enclosed, basically estuarian river valley, but it was, or would have been, suitable for cavalry, the Persians' strongest military arm being cavalry, in particular mounted archers, which don't work so well in forests and likewise don't work so well in really rough mountainous country. So there are a lot of reasons that Marathon was a likely place for the Persians to disembark. It's not clear exactly how big their forces were. The tendency of modern military historians in assessing ancient accounts of battles, accounts of ancient battles, if you will, is ordinarily radically to downgrade the ancient figures for how many troops were involved. That frame of mind at work, people are inclined these days to say that the Persian forces probably numbered 20-odd thousand or thereabouts, maybe as many as 40, hard to tell for sure. In any case, they clearly outnumbered the forces of the Athenians, which were less than 10,000, with about 1,000 troops as a surprise help from their nearby ally in Boeotia, the little city or polis of Plataea. That would have made the Athenian forces outnumbered something on the order of 2-to-1 or more, maybe 4-to-1, maybe 3-to-1, maybe even more than that. Hard to say for sure, but no doubt about it, the Athenians were significantly outnumbered about 25 miles away from Athens itself at Marathon. And there they waited for a while. And the wait has exercised the ingenuity of scholars. My own suspicion is, and there's some ancient evidence for this, that the Persians were waiting for a pro-Persian, pro-Hippias faction in Athens to rise in support of Hippias and the Persians, and hence, in some sense, to make a battle certainly easier, if not, in fact, simply unnecessary. And there's talk of, on the mountains between Marathon and Athens, bronze shields being used as signals to suggest when and if the hoped-for uprising took place. In the event it didn't. But there's another mystery of sorts about Marathon, and that is the Persians' strongest military arm was their cavalry. And shortly before the actual Battle of Marathon, their cavalry set off in horse transports to round Cape Sunion, the southernmost cape of Attica, to sail to Athens itself. Whether there was some kind of mix-up, whether plans went astray, whatever the problem was, when push came to shove, quite literally, the Persians found themselves at Marathon without their cavalry, who were literally at sea at the time, and hence without their strongest arm, and hence unable to flank the Atheno-Plataean line, which would have been a relatively easy matter for cavalry to accomplish. In any case, soon after the ships departed, whether the Athenians realized that they'd departed or not, I suspect that they probably did, the Athenians formed up their own line of hoplites fighting in phalanx form. The Persians outnumbered them, so to stretch themselves thin enough so that they could confront the Persian infantry line which they were facing at equal distance without being flanked even by infantry on the sides, they had to thin their line in the center. The Atheno-Plataean line at Marathon reportedly was 8 deep on the flanks, which was the usual number, but only 2 deep in the center. They had to thin out the lines to prevent themselves from being flanked. At this point, too, with the Battle of Lade and the quelling of the Ionian revolt still in very recent and severe memory, indeed that's why the Persians were there, it was to be expected, and the Persians clearly did expect, that Athenian morale against Persian forces would be low. There had been no major victory anywhere, any time so far of Hellenic or Greek forces against Persian forces, and indeed in the days beforehand, Eretria had already fallen. Thus, the Persians were very surprised when, after getting as close as they could to the Persians, I would suspect probably within archery range, the Athenians and Plataeans broke into a trot and charged them, if not at a run. I'm not sure how running in full armor for an extended distance works, though in fact there was an Olympic contest in precisely that event in the ancient Olympics. But nevertheless, they crashed into the Persian lines at a run, which that in itself is a sign of high morale and eagerness. Evidently short-stepped the Persians just a bit. What happened once the Othismos, the battle line, was joined was the Persian center, which was thicker than the Greek center, the Athenian center, began to push and indeed even slightly began to break through the only 2 hoplite line at that point. But meanwhile, the Greek wings bested their Persian opponents and closed in on the Persian center. And the Athenians won, and won big. One reason for their victory was the disproportion in armament between the two forces. The Athenian soldiers and Plataean soldiers here were hoplites, heavily armored with shield, helmet, and so forth. The Persians, by contrast, fought with wicker shields, which were designed primarily to deflect or slow down arrows, and fought as well not in armor, but in something like a stuffed winter coat, padded with fiber, which again was designed to slow down the impact of arrows and to dull the impact of edged weapons, but was nowhere near as effective as bronze. As a result, the Persian troops were certainly more mobile, but when it came to close-in, hand-to-hand fighting, they found themselves at a very considerable disadvantage, especially if they were unsupported by their cavalry, as in this instance they were. Well, the Marathonomachoi, the men of Marathon, the men who fought at Marathon, were considered and considered themselves the best and noblest of the Athenians ever after, and were told that the casualties for the Battle of Marathon came out as follows. As usual, the victorious side the side that did not flee, suffering many, many fewer. The Athenians purportedly lost precisely 192 dead. And indeed, in the Parthenon frieze, there is a section which contains precisely 192 figures, which many people have thought was a memorial of sorts to the men who were killed at Marathon. The Persians, according to Herodotus, by contrast, lost about 6,400. So it was a major, virtually a crushing defeat for Persia and a major victory for Athens. Lots of the casualties came as the Persians were fleeing to their ships and attempting to disembark. And it's there that the brother of Aeschylus, the playwright, lost his life. He was attempting to hold back a Persian ship which was attempting to flee and got his hand cut off and bled to death. Aeschylus himself participated in the battle, and interestingly, when many years later he came to die, he did not mention his work as a tragedian on his grave, but said instead that the long-haired Mede, the long-haired Persian, could testify to his courage too, as a veteran, certainly of Marathon, and very probably of Salamis as well. Well, the Athenians knew perfectly well that they had not defeated the whole Persian force, that part of the Persian force was already on the way to Athens, and the rest of them had disembarked. So immediately after the battle, they marched the 25 miles back to Athens, hoping to beat the Persian fleet, which they succeeded in doing. And indeed, shortly after they arrived, the Persian fleet turned up in the harbor, saw the same guys they'd fought earlier on, thought better of the matter, and went home. End, so to speak, of round one. Well, as you might imagine, Darius, with vastly, overwhelmingly, all but unimaginably greater resources at his disposal than any conceivable Greek coalition, was unwilling to take the result of the Battle of Marathon as the final word on Greco-Persian relations, and immediately set about planning to take care of his Hellenic problem once and for all by either intimidating the whole region into submitting, or, in the case of certainly Sparta and Athens, conquering and destroying them. He, however, died before he was able to accomplish his aims. He was succeeded by his son Xerxes, who was very eager to match, or if possible, to exceed the accomplishments of his predecessors, Cyrus, Cambyses, and Darius, particularly Cyrus and Darius. And he continued preparations for a much bigger, full-scale invasion of Greece, at which he himself would be present. His plans were deflected, though, by, among other things, a revolt in Egypt, which had to be put down. But that accomplished in 484, he began to make preparations in earnest, sending emissaries to ask for earth and water from all the Greek polis available, except for Athens and Sparta, who for obvious reasons were deliberately excluded. They had not treated his previous emissaries, or the previous Persian emissaries, very well. And he began building supply dumps along his provisional invasion route into Greece. Astonishingly, for a while this was disbelieved, but archaeological evidence has in fact confirmed it. He also set his subjects to work making a canal across the landward end of the Athos Peninsula so that his ships would not fall into the trouble that Mardonius' failed invasion attempt had fallen into roughly a decade before, and they dug all the way through. The remains of that canal still survive. It was evidently wide enough that ships could go through either direction simultaneously. He also made plans to bridge the Hellespont with bridges roughly a mile wide, pontoon bridges, and set out orders for the requisite ropes, huge, thick ropes to secure this pontoon bridge to be made, and began gathering his forces. In common with most people, most places, most times, lots of Greeks did not take the threat, the gathering storm, with full seriousness while it was far off. But by the late 480s, the signs were clear that trouble of an unprecedented magnitude was on its way.
This ends Lecture 8. A History of Ancient Sparta, Lecture 9. Their Finest Hour, Artemisium and Thermopylae, Part 1.
Sometime about 485, Sparta consulted the Delphic oracle once again, this time about upcoming events, and received the disturbing news that, so far as hostilities with Persia were concerned, Sparta would either have a king die in battle, which so far as we know had not happened up to that point to Sparta, or Sparta would be destroyed. And there was reason to be upset on other grounds. They were worried about the impiety of having executed the Spartan herald, rather the Persian heralds who had asked for earth and water years before. They felt that they were perhaps suffering from some kind of ritual pollution, and according to Herodotus, asked for volunteers to go to Xerxes, to offer to let Xerxes execute them in expiation, and indeed 2 volunteers, both very prominent high-level Spartans, so we're told, did volunteer by the names, as it happened, of Sperthius and Bulas, and they made their way to Xerxes, who was duly impressed, but told them, no, in Persia, we're not that impious ourselves. We're not that impious. We don't kill heralds. Go on home. So they did. But that does reveal how seriously the Spartans took, on one hand, the threat, on the other hand, the danger of impiety. Well, by 481, Persian preparations were far enough advanced that the relatively few Greek polis, or polises, who felt compelled to resist the advance of Persia, and it was a distinct minority, decided they had better, for the moment at least, overcome their differences and offer a united front. And they formed what has been since called the Hellenic League in a meeting at the Isthmus of Corinth. A likely spot to meet for several reasons. Corinth was a prominent member, of course, probably other than Sparta, the most prominent member of the Peloponnesian League. Most of the polities that had refused to submit to Persia were, in fact, in the Peloponnese, led, of course, by Sparta herself. And the Peloponnese, the isthmus leading into the Peloponnese, in fact, seemed to many Peloponnesians in particular readily defensible. It's only 6 kilometers, about 4 miles wide, and the plan was to erect a wall and mount a defense right there, or at least one of the plans was to do so. The Hellenic League cast their nets as far as they could, seeking allies. They tried to persuade Gelon, the tyrant of Syracuse, in the island of Sicily, a Greek, to join them, and Gelon was a very powerful character, and Syracuse a very powerful state. He consented to join if he could lead the expedition, or at least be half leader, and the rest of the alliance was unwilling to accede to those demands, which is probably just as well, because at the same time he was facing a massive threat from Carthage, whom he purportedly defeated on the very same day as the Battle of Salamis in a naval contest of essentially, or in a contest of essentially the same size and magnitude. They also tried to gain allies from Crete. Nope. From the island that we now know as Corfu, called in those days Corcyra. They said, yeah, maybe, and sent their fleet in the event to the southern tip of the Peloponnese, where they waited things out to see how it would go. But they did not, in fact, participate. Both Athens and Argos wanted to control the expedition, or at least to have joint control, Athens in particular, by sea. But the consensus of the League was that they wanted the Spartans in charge of things, and appointed to command the fleet was a Spartan by the name of Eurybiades, and appointed to command, at least at Thermopylae on land, was the Spartan king Leonidas. The defense at Thermopylae and the concurrent defense at Artemisium at the northern end of the island of Euboea, which we've already spoken of, was not, in fact, the first attempt at defense which the Hellenic League made. Their first attempt was further north at what's called the Vale of Tempe, in the valley of the Peneus River, near Mount Olympus, further north in Greece. And early on in 480, as the troops of Xerxes were advancing under the leadership of the Spartan Euenidas and of the Athenian Themistocles, the alliance dispatched 10,000 hoplites, a lot, by sea to try to hold the line at Tempe, further north. When they got there, though, They realized that the position could be turned by a variety of passes, through which Xerxes did, in fact, proceed with his army, and so, wishing to avoid being flanked, they withdrew and thought the problem through once again. Xerxes' army was huge. Herodotus gives a figure which pretty much no one believes, of roughly 2.5 million troops, with another 2.5 million in support. Some modern authorities size things down to 80,000. I find that implausibly small myself. It was immense. If I had to guess, for what it's worth, and it's probably not worth much, I would guess somewhere in the neighborhood of 250,000 or thereabouts. Again, I think we tend to underestimate the sophistication and general extensiveness of the works of ancient civilizations. Be that as it may, it was huge. It was the biggest army anybody had ever seen, and Herodotus also gives the figure of 1,207 warships with various other ships, a good deal more of them as supply ships accompanying the expedition. The amphibious character and the necessarily amphibious character of the expedition is something that requires some emphasis. To feed under ancient conditions and ancient transportation conditions, an army of that size, even with pre-established supply dumps, is a really formidable undertaking. The logistics are very challenging indeed, and the plan throughout was for Xerxes' army to march around the shore of the Aegean with the fleet accompanying it. And the fleet had to accompany it. One reason why, Themistocles at least, and others thought that the planned defense at the Isthmus of Corinth line wouldn't work, was as long as Xerxes had a fleet in being, he could simply bypass the Isthmus of Corinth with his fleet and land troops somewhere else and then take the Isthmus line in a pincher movement, which meant that any Greek defense was going to have to confront, preferably simultaneously, both the Persian fleet and the Persian army, which is what the Greeks then, by August, had decided to do. August of the year 480, which means, by the way, that August of the year 2010 will be the 2500th anniversary, or of the year actually 2520 will be the 2500th anniversary of these events. 2510, the anniversary of Marathon. Astonishingly enough, in 480, the Greeks were holding the Olympics, even as the Persians advanced, seeking to conquer all of Hellas. Nevertheless, in Hellas in the northwest Peloponnese, at Olympia, the Olympic Games were in progress, and not only that, as usual, the Spartans were celebrating the Carnea and were hesitant to detach more folks than they had to. Nevertheless, by about the third week in August of 480, the Greeks had taken up what they assumed would be their most favorable forward positions. Since Athens was resisting Persia, and Athens lay on the non-Peloponnesian side of the Isthmus of Corinth, the Athenians were understandably eager to have at least some major defense mounted before Attica got invaded. Just to withdraw and leave Athens itself to the mercy of the Persians was not at first thought something that very much appealed to the Athenians. For those and other reasons, they decided to mount this defense in advance of the homelands of the majority of the resisting states at Thermopylae on one hand and at Artemision on the other. Thermopylae, as it happens, is almost due north of Delphi. It's northwest of Athens in the Malian Gulf, as it's called, which extends westward from the north part of the island of Euboea. Artemision is on the north part of Euboea itself, where there was a temple to Artemis, hence the name Artemision. They decided that their best bet would be to mount a defense there. The Persian fleet was going to have to go around Euboea one way or another, on the inland side or on the Aegean outside. The inland side at one point gets very, very narrow indeed, way less than a mile. They thought that this would work to their advantage, and by placing the fleet at Artemision, they would be in position to deal with the Persians whichever way they decided to proceed. Thermopylae was chosen very, very carefully as well. The site now is well inland from the Malian Gulf. That was not true in ancient times. There have been a lot of estuarian deposits in the meanwhile, which have assured that the shoreline is distant from the actual point which the Greeks defended. At that point, Thermopylae, there were hot springs there, hence the name Thermopylae, which means hot gates, was at its narrowest a tract maybe 50 feet wide, 20 meters wide max, maybe a little less than that. We are told that it was sufficient that two wagons could pass each other barely, with, on the one hand, the sea, and on the other hand, relatively sheer, not really cliff-like, but steep mountain walls. Thus, it was a choke point. And if, as they did, the Persians wanted to get further south to Athens, to the Peloponnese, they were going to have to go through Thermopylae, and that would be a good place to resist them, in large part because the narrowness of the pass would assure that A, Persian cavalry would not be useful. It was too steep on the one side and, of course, ocean on the other, and B, only a limited number of Persians could engage at any given time. Accordingly, in the third week of August, a Greek detachment was sent to hold that pass. There are a lot of complexities here. Purportedly, with the Carnea, at least when they were detached, still going on, the group which was sent to Thermopylae was an advance force, with more coming, and the idea being that the Hellenic alliance would mount a real thoroughgoing defense at Thermopylae. That's one side of it. On the other side of it, Leonidas led a carefully picked group of precisely 300 full Spartans, with Helot retainers and others, but 300 full Spartans. No accident, precisely the number of the traditional royal bodyguard of the Hippies, as they were called, who were young men in the early age groups. These guys, however, were not. These were all men deliberately picked who had sons who were alive. That in itself suggests that right from the outset, the Spartans conceived it in some sense as a suicide mission, so too do the reported final words of Leonidas to his wife Gorgo as he departed. He, again, her half-uncle, somewhere about 25 years older than she, both in the royal family by birth as well as by marriage, and his parting shot to her when she asked for advice was, we are told, marry a good man and bear good children, which does not sound like the advice of a man who expects to be coming home again. If that's the case, though, the question becomes, what exactly did they think they were doing? As the Spartans, originally a more considerable contingent, about 4,000 total, advanced on Thermopylae to face an army which at the absolute minimum outnumbered them 20 to 1, if not 50 to 1, if not thousands to 1. What did they think they were doing? Well, one answer to that question, it may be, is provided by the oracle which the Spartans had received some years before, suggesting that either a king of Sparta must die in battle or Sparta would be defeated, and Sparta would not have been eager to have either of those events transpire. But there's little question, if it came to that, which they would have preferred. And Herodotus thinks, and I suspect too, that part of what Leonidas was up to was to send himself off there to die in order to deflect from Sparta the prophesied total destruction. In any case, they set up shop in the pass of Thermopylae and waited. And at this point, the account of Herodotus gets very interesting. We are told that Xerxes could not believe that this tiny force seriously attempted to resist them. So he asked in his entourage, the former king Demaratus, who you will remember from previous lectures, what's going on? Will these people really fight me, outnumbered as they are? To which Demaratus, according to Herodotus, replies, Sire, since you insist that I speak the truth and say nothing for which you could later accuse me of falsehood, here it is. In Hellas, poverty is always and forever a native resident, while excellence is something acquired through intelligence and the force of strict law. It's through the exercise of this excellence that Hellas wards off both poverty and despotism. Now, while I commend all the Hellenes who live in the Dorian lands, what I shall tell you next applies not to all of them, but only to the Lacedaemonians. First of all, there is no way that they will accept your stated intention to enslave Hellas. Next, even if all the other Hellenes come to see things your way, the Spartans will certainly oppose you in battle. And you need not ask as to their number in order to consider how they could possibly do this, for if there are 1,000 of them marching out, they will fight you, and if they number more or less than that, it makes no difference. They will fight you all the same. Xerxes doesn't believe it. How could 1,000 or even 10,000 or 50,000 men, all of them alike being free and lacking one man to rule over them, stand up to an army as great as mine? Even if there are 5,000 of them, will outnumber them more than 1,000 to 1. To which, famously, Demaratus replies, The Lacedaemonians are no worse than other men when they fight individually, but when they unite and fight together, they are the best warriors of all. For though they are free, they're not free in all respects, for they're actually ruled by a lord and master. Law is their master, and it's the law that they inwardly fear, much more so than your men fear you. They do whatever it commands, which is always the same. It forbids them to flee from battle, and no matter how many men they're fighting, it orders them to remain in their rank and either prevail or perish. As Demaratus puts it, and Herodotus puts it, in defense of their freedom and of the freedom of the Greeks. Well, Xerxes still doesn't believe it, and so he sends a scout to see what the Lacedaemonians and their allies are doing as they wait for Xerxes to come in close and engage. And what the scout sees, Herodotus describes in the following terms. It just so happened that at that moment the Lacedaemonians were posted outside the main pass, and the scout saw some of these men exercising and others combing their hair, which astonished him. After he'd ascertained their number and every other detail, he rode back undisturbed, for no one pursued him. In fact, he was practically ignored. When he returned, he reported all that he had seen to Xerxes. Again, then, he sends to Demaratus to explain. And Demaratus says, "You heard what I said about these men before, when we were just setting out against Hellas, and you made me a laughingstock when you heard my view of how these matters would turn out. But it's my greatest goal to tell you the truth in your presence, so hear me now. These men have come to fight us for control of the road. That's really what they're preparing to do, for it's their tradition that they groom their hair whenever they're about to put their lives in danger. But now know this, if you subjugate these men and those who've remained behind in Sparta, there is no other race of human beings that'll be left to raise their hands against you. For you are now attacking the most noble kingdom of all the Hellenes and the best of men." Xerxes waits for a few days and then, losing patience, decides to attempt to force the pass. And he sends strong troops in to begin with, and ultimately his strongest troops, the so-called 10,000 immortals. The Greeks imagined that they were so called because once any one of them died or was killed, he was immediately replaced. So the number always stayed at 10,000, and nobody for 2 days makes much headway. Indeed, the Spartans in particular are so well trained that they cause a lot of casualties by feigned retreats. They would fight in a forward line, then pretend to be broken, run back with a great deal of whooping and hollering. According to Herodotus, the folks they were fighting against would follow them, and then on cue, the Spartans would turn and come back and attack them while they were in disorder, and the casualties mounted and mounted and mounted, and Xerxes grew more and more frustrated. It wasn't only Spartans who were there, though Spartans, unsurprisingly, according to Herodotus, demonstrated far and away the most skill. There were also various more or less local forces and some people from Thespians, as they were called, in Boeotia, and some people from Thebes, also in Boeotia, in these forces. But the Spartans seems to have taken the leadership role, and although there were some casualties on the Greek side, the casualties on the Persian side were orders of magnitude, at least an order of magnitude greater, and Xerxes was not making much headway at all, even though mounted above, he was watching the battle as it progressed. At that point, a local who Herodotus is at pains to record for the sake of assuring his enduring ignominy, a fellow by the name of Ephialtes, tells Xerxes about a pass through the mountains, a relatively difficult pass by which he can get behind the position at Thermopylae and box the defenders. The pass is called the Anopeia. Leonidas knew about it, and on the theory that their lands were most directly threatened by the Persians, had put the local detachment of Phocians or Phocians to guard that pass. Well, after 2 days of fighting, Xerxes sends off his 10,000, his immortals, on a night march over the Anopeia. And about midway through it, according to Herodotus, they're rustling fallen oak leaves, and the sound alerts the Phocians. They attack the Phocians, and the Phocians withdraw to prepare themselves to withstand an attack from the immortals, but the immortals instead, after driving them away from the path itself, just walk on by. And by the time dawn comes, the immortals are behind the position which the Spartans are defending. At this point, and there's some dispute about this, either most of the folks who are defending the pass took advantage of their few remaining moments for potential escape and departed, or, I think more likely, Leonidas sent them off. That's the standard account, and that, I suspect, is what really happened. The only folks who stayed were the Spartans, the Thespians, and some Thebans who were in an odd position. According to Herodotus, Thebes really was by and large in favor of Persia, and these were the Thebans who disagreed. Certainly, Thebes did later Medize and paid the price for it in bad reputation for many years to come. But whatever the truth, there were Thebans there as well when the final stand took place. Leonidas purportedly told his troops to have a good breakfast because that for dinner that night they'd be dining with Hades. And when the time came, they fought to the last man, all killed. Supposedly, they fought so fiercely that after a while, having had enough even of these folks fighting with broken weapons and fingernails and teeth, they just withdrew and buried them with arrows until there was nobody left alive. And Xerxes was so frustrated that, to some degree contrary to Persian custom, he mutilated the body of Leonidas when he figured out which of the bodies was Leonidas. The story goes, and this is evidently true, that there were 2 of the Spartan contingent of 300 who were at that point suffering from eye infections, which made them effectively blind. And Leonidas ordered them both home, since he didn't think they could fight very well, under the circumstances being blind. One of them ordered his helot to bring him to the line and died fighting, and the other one did indeed go home, where he was so thoroughly disgraced that he fought with suicidal abandon the next year, because his life as a known trembler or tresante had become impossible to him. The Spartans were impressed, but not that impressed. They didn't really like suicidal fighting. They liked self-controlled fighting, and he was doing a little bit too much. But in any case, Xerxes succeeded, finally, in forcing the pass. What he did not succeed in doing, and this, I suspect, was in some sense the point all along, was intimidating the Greeks or breaking the Greeks' spirit. Indeed, the Greeks were energized after Thermopylae, and Xerxes was disheartened. Clearly, these Hellenes, Spartans in particular, but Hellenes in general, were a lot more formidable than anybody he had ever encountered before, and dealing with them, even with huge odds in his own favor, was no laughing matter. On the other hand, the Greeks thought, we can fight these guys. We did very well. We lost, but we did very, very well. And in some sense, the sacrifice of Leonidas at Thermopylae enlivened the Greeks, encouraged the Greeks, crystallized Greek resolve to make good the rest of the defense against Persia. It was, in some sense, a willing Spartan sacrifice on behalf not just of Sparta, but of Greece as a whole, and it was certainly the Spartans' finest hour, and to the extent that the Spartans have gained the admiration of posterity, it was here, above all, that they gained it. The epitaphs at the time suggest as much, and they are in their own way very moving. Here's one. 3 million foes were once fought right here by 4,000 men from the Peloponnese. And then probably the most famous epitaph of all time for the 300, composed purportedly by the poet Simonides. Go tell the Spartans, stranger, passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. You can still go. It's still there. You can still see it. The bravest of the Spartans after the battle was purportedly a fellow by the name of Dionysius, who Stephen Pressfield makes the hero of his own novelization of the battle, Gates of Fire. Herodotus attributes to Dionysius one of the most famous of laconic comments. He is told by a Trachinian friend that the Persians are so many that when they shoot their arrows, it darkens the sun. To which we are told, Dionysius replied, all the better, my friend. We'll fight in the shade. And so they did.
This ends Lecture 9.
Esse é um áudio, ou parte do áudio que eu tenho, de um professor que eu não sei quem é. Vamos ver se o YouTube detecta. Daí eu indico pra vocês, senão eu posto o resto depois. Essa parte aqui é a que eu precisava reouvir, porque eu vou fazer um vídeo sobre isso. Muito obrigado por quem colou. Talvez eu vá lá no roxinho depois. E para não preencher muito aqui de áudio em português, caso a galera só queira treinar o inglês aqui, A gente se fala mais.